The candle on the dining table had burned down maybe half an inch when my son-in-law's father picked up his glass of Cabernet and threw it in my daughter's face. The wine splashed across her cheek, ran down her white sweater, pooled in the cloth napkin she'd been holding in her lap. She didn't scream. She didn't move. She just sat there, blinking, with red wine dripping off her chin onto a Thanksgiving turkey that had taken her 4 hours to cook. And her husband laughed. He actually laughed. Then he raised his own glass toward his father and said, "Thanks, Dad. Maybe that'll teach her some respect." I felt my hands grip the edges of the chair so hard my knuckles went white. I didn't say anything. Not yet. I just sat there, watching my daughter's hands tremble in her lap, watching her try to keep her chin up, watching her swallow whatever she wanted to say, because she'd learned a long time ago that saying anything in that house only made it worse. My name is... well, that doesn't matter. What matters is that I was 63 years old that November, a widower of 11 years, and I'd spent the last 7 of those years biting my tongue every time my daughter tried to convince me her marriage wasn't as bad as it looked. I'd watched her grow quieter at family dinners. I'd watched her stop laughing the way she used to when she was a kid. I'd watched her start wearing long sleeves in the summer and saying she was just cold. And every time I tried to bring it up, she'd say, "Dad, please, you don't understand. His family is just different. Different. His family is just different." Different, that's the word she used. But that night, sitting in the dining room of a 6-bedroom house in Greenwich, Connecticut, watching my only child wipe wine off her own face while her husband and his father chuckled like they'd just told a great joke, I decided I was done being polite. I was done pretending. I was done watching. I just needed to make one phone call first. Let me back up. I'd been invited to Thanksgiving dinner at the Mercer house for the 7th year in a row. My daughter, the only family I had left in this world, had married Brent Mercer when she was 26. He was 31 then, an investment banker, the kind of man who wore expensive shoes and talked about verticals and deliverables, and looked at everyone over the rim of his glasses like they were running late for something. His father, Conrad Mercer, was a real estate developer who'd made his money in the 80s putting up strip malls outside of Hartford, and had spent the next 30 years making sure everyone knew about it. The first time I met Conrad, he asked me what I did. I told him I worked with my hands. He nodded the way you nod at a waiter who just told you the soup of the day. Then he turned to my daughter and said, "Sweetheart, your father seems like a real working-class American. We need more of those." Like I was a museum exhibit, I let it slide. I let a lot of things slide back then. I let it slide when Conrad introduced me at a barbecue as my son's father-in-law, the janitor. I'd never been a janitor in my life, but Conrad had decided that's what I was, and I figured correcting him wasn't worth the trouble. My daughter looked mortified. I winked at her and said, "Best job in the world, plenty of time to think." I let it slide when Brant told my daughter in front of me at her own birthday dinner that she should really start dressing better. "You look like your dad's mailman." I let it slide when, at her 30th birthday party, Conrad raised a toast and said, "To our daughter-in-law, who is punching way above her weight, we love you anyway, sweetheart." I let it slide because my daughter looked at me with eyes that begged me not to make a scene. Because, she said, on the drive home one night, "Dad, please. I love him. He's not like that all the time. You don't see the good parts." I told myself she was a grown woman. I told myself she had to make her own choices. I told myself that if I stepped in, she'd hate me and stay with him out of spite. I told myself a lot of things to justify keeping my mouth shut, but I was watching. I was always watching. Now, Thanksgiving, the 7th one. I drove up from Pennsylvania the night before, stopped at the gas station outside of Allentown, got a cup of coffee that tasted like burnt rubber, and called my daughter to let her know I'd be in by morning. She answered on the 3rd ring, whispered, "Hi, Dad," and I could hear in her voice that she'd been crying. "You okay, kiddo?" "I'm fine, I'm just tired. Cooking." "You know." "I know." I got there at 9 in the morning. Brant opened the door in a sweater that probably cost more than my truck, looked at my flannel shirt, and said, "Oh, good, you brought the lumberjack costume." My daughter was in the kitchen. She had flour on her cheek. She was wearing makeup that didn't quite cover the shadow under her left eye. I didn't say anything about it. I just hugged her, and I held on a second longer than I usually do, and she pressed her forehead against my shoulder for a moment and then pulled away and said, "Help me with the pie crust, Dad. I can't get it to roll right." I helped her with the pie crust, Dad. I can't get it to roll right. The Mercers arrived at 2. Conrad in a navy blazer with gold buttons. His wife, Margot, in a string of pearls that probably could have paid off a mortgage. Brant's sister, Whitley, with her husband and their 2 kids who I'd met maybe 4 times and who still called me the other grandpa, with this little smirk like it was a punchline. Conrad walked in, looked around the dining room my daughter had spent 2 days decorating, and said, "Brant, did the help do this? It's a little overdone, isn't it?" The help. Meaning my daughter. Brant laughed. My daughter smiled tight, the way she'd learned to smile, and said, "I did it myself, Conrad. I thought you'd like it." "Oh, sweetheart, of course. It's lovely, in a small-town way." We sat down to eat at 4. The turkey was perfect. I want to say that. My daughter had brined it for 2 days, basted it every 20 minutes, served it with a side of cranberry orange relish she'd made from scratch because Margot had once mentioned, 3 Thanksgivings ago, that she preferred fresh cranberries to canned. Conrad took a bite, set down his fork, and said, "It's dry." My daughter froze. "Oh, I'm sorry, I can." No. Don't apologize. We can't all be Julia Child. Brant, son, pass the gravy. Maybe we can salvage this. That was the warm-up. It went on like that for 40 minutes. Every dish, every side, every detail criticized. Margot pushed her plate away after 3 bites and said she'd eat something real when we got back to the hotel. Whitley made a face at the green bean casserole and said, "Oh, honey, you used the canned mushroom soup, didn't you? You can tell." And my daughter just kept her head down, kept refilling water glasses, kept asking if anyone wanted seconds, kept apologizing. I sat there. I ate. I didn't say a word. Then Conrad started in on the business. "Brant, tell me, what's your wife actually doing these days? She used to talk about that little online shop. Is that still a thing?" "Dad, she gave up on that. It wasn't working." "It was working," my daughter said quietly. "I had to put it on hold because..." "Because what, sweetheart?" Conrad interrupted. "Because it wasn't making money? Because you can't get up before noon? What is it you do all day in this house anyway?" She looked at her plate. "Honey," Conrad said, leaning forward, "how much did you make last year? 12,000? 15? My son makes that in a week. You're not contributing. You're a hobby, and hobbies should be encouraged, but they shouldn't make the hobbyist forget her place." I felt my jaw tighten. I set down my fork. I didn't say anything yet. I was still listening. "Conrad," my daughter said very quietly, "I'd appreciate it if we could talk about something else." "Excuse me?" I said I'd like to talk about something else. "Please." Conrad smiled. Then he picked up his glass of red wine, looked her straight in the eye, and tossed it in her face. The room went silent. The wine ran down her cheek, down her sweater, pooled in her napkin. She didn't move. And Brant laughed. "Thanks, Dad. Maybe that'll teach her some respect." That was the moment. That was the moment I knew I was done. I sat there for maybe 5 more seconds, just looking at my daughter, watching the wine drip off her jaw onto the tablecloth she'd ironed that morning, watching her hands shake, watching her try, even then, to compose herself, to not make a scene, to swallow whatever scream was sitting in her throat. I stood up. I didn't say anything to anyone at the table. I just walked into the kitchen. I picked up the dish towel hanging off the oven handle. I walked back to the dining room. I bent down next to my daughter, and I gently, very gently, wiped the wine off her cheek, off her chin, off the front of her sweater as best I could. She started crying, not loud, just her shoulders shaking and tears running down through where the wine still was. "Sweetheart," I said, "look at me." She did. "Go upstairs, go change, pack a bag, we're leaving in 20 minutes. Dad, 20 minutes. Dad, 20 minutes. I straightened up. I turned to face the table. Conrad was staring at me like I'd just spit on his shoes. Margot looked horrified. Brant's smirk had faltered for the first time all afternoon. "What did you just say to my wife?" Brant asked. I looked at him. I really looked at him, this soft-handed 38-year-old man who'd spent 7 years grinding my daughter down into something small enough to fit in his pocket. This grown man who just laughed while his father humiliated her in her own home. "I'm taking her home," I said. "She's not staying here tonight. She's not staying here ever again." Brant stood up. "You don't get to make that decision. This is my house. She's my wife. You don't get to walk in here and sit down, Brant." I said it real quiet. "Sit down before I make you." He sat down before I make you. He sat down. I walked out of the dining room. My daughter was already heading up the stairs. I went out to the front porch, pulled the storm door closed behind me, and I took my phone out of my pocket. I dialed a number I hadn't dialed in 8 years. The line picked up on the second ring. "It's been a while, old man. I need you to do me a favor. Anything, you know that. It's about my daughter and the family she married into." There was a pause. Then, "Tell me where to start." I told him. "Now." I said I worked with my hands. That part was true. My daddy was a millwright in western Pennsylvania, and I grew up in a town where you either worked at the plant or you got out. I got out, but not the way most kids did. I joined the Army at 18, did 2 tours, came back, and got recruited into something I'm not going to name on the internet. Let's just say I spent 31 years of my life in a job that didn't have a sign on the door, that paid me in cash and silence, and that introduced me to a lot of men in a lot of places who owed me favors I never called in. I retired at 55. My wife died of pancreatic cancer 4 years later. After that, I bought a piece of land in central Pennsylvania, built a small house on it with my own 2 hands, and spent my time fishing and reading and trying not to think too much about the things I'd done. I never told my daughter any of it. She thought I'd been a logistics contractor. She thought I'd spent my career in warehouses and shipping yards. She believed it because I let her believe it. Some things you don't pass down to your kids. But I'd kept the phone numbers. The man I called that Thanksgiving afternoon was a guy I'd worked with for 14 years. He'd retired the same year I did. He'd gone into a different line of work after, something legitimate now, something that involved a lot of suits and a lot of conference rooms and a lot of access. He didn't know me anything in particular. We just had the kind of friendship that didn't need to be maintained because it didn't go anywhere. We checked in once a year maybe, around Christmas. When I called him that afternoon, I told him what had happened. I told him about Conrad Mercer. I told him about the 7 years of slow grinding. I told him about my daughter's eye. He was quiet for a long minute. Then he said, "Give me 48 hours." I went back inside. My daughter was at the top of the stairs with a duffel bag in her hand. She'd changed into a clean sweatshirt. Her eyes were red, but her chin was up. I noticed that. She wasn't shaking anymore. We walked down the stairs together. Brant was waiting in the foyer with his arms crossed. "You're not seriously leaving?" "I am," my daughter said, and her voice was steady. I want you to understand that. Her voice was steady for the first time in 7 years. "You walk out that door. You don't come back. You hear me? You don't come back." She looked at him. Just looked at him. Then she said, "Okay." We walked out. I drove her back to Pennsylvania that night. We didn't talk much. She slept for most of it, her head against the window, and I kept glancing over at her at red lights and thinking about how she used to fall asleep in the back of my truck when she was 4, with her stuffed rabbit clutched against her chest and her mouth hanging open. She slept in the guest room that night. I sat in the kitchen until 2 in the morning drinking coffee and waiting for my phone to ring. It didn't ring until Saturday morning. "You sitting down? Tell me. Your son-in-law's father has a real interesting history. Go on." Conrad Mercer's real estate empire is built on 3 commercial properties he picked up in 1987, 1989, and 1991. The 1987 property was a strip mall in West Hartford that was the subject of an arson investigation in 1986 that was never closed. The original owner died in the fire. Conrad bought the lot at a tax auction 9 months later for 42 cents on the dollar. Same pattern for the 1989 property. Different town, different fire, different owner who, in that case, didn't die, but did lose everything and ended up taking his own life 6 months later. The 1991 property is the cleanest of the three, but it was bought from a man who'd taken out a loan from a guy named Gallo, who's been a person of interest in a federal racketeering investigation since 2019. I sat down. I hadn't realized I was standing. What else? Conrad Mercer has been laundering money for a man named Salvatore Mancuso for the last 11 years. Mancuso operates out of New Jersey. Construction, waste management, you know the deal. Conrad's been moving Mancuso's money through 3 of his commercial properties in Connecticut. The FBI has known about it for about 2.5 years. They've been waiting for a clean way to get to Mancuso. Conrad was always going to be collateral, but they didn't have enough to move on him yet. How much would it take? It would take a witness, or it would take someone walking the right file into the right office on Monday morning. Can that happen? It can happen by Tuesday. I closed my eyes. And the son? Brett Mercer is cleaner. But not clean. He's been front-running trades for his firm's largest client for about 4 years. It's small enough that nobody's looked, but it's not small enough to hide if somebody does. SEC complaint, 2-year investigation minimum, probably a deferred prosecution. He'll lose his license to trade. He'll lose his job. He'll lose his bonuses going back 4 years. Do it. All of it? You sure? He threw wine in my daughter's face. His father laughed. My daughter sat in her own home and let strangers humiliate her for 7 years because she thought she had to be polite. So yeah, I'm sure. Give it 3 weeks. It took 2. On the morning of December 17th, federal agents arrived at Conrad Mercer's house in Greenwich with a warrant. They took him out in handcuffs in front of his wife and his housekeeper and 3 neighbors who'd been walking their dogs. The arrest made the local news, then the regional news, then the Wall Street Journal by Wednesday because of the connection to Mancuso, who was indicted the same day in New Jersey. The SEC complaint against Brandt landed 48 hours later. His firm placed him on immediate administrative leave. Within a week, he'd been informed that the firm would not be defending him, that his employment was terminated, and that the partners had voted unanimously to claw back his bonuses, going back 3 years. The bonuses were structured as deferred compensation. He didn't have most of the money anymore. He had the house. He had the cars. He had a wardrobe of cashmere sweaters and a wine cellar. The house was in Conrad's name. Conrad's assets were frozen, pending the federal investigation. The cars were leased. My daughter filed for divorce on January 9th. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me tell you about the week between Thanksgiving and the first call. My daughter slept for almost 2 days. When she got up, she came into the kitchen in one of my old flannels, sat down at the table, and asked me for coffee. I poured her a cup. She wrapped her hands around it the way she used to wrap her hands around her cocoa when she was a kid coming in from the snow. "Dad," she said, "I have to tell you something." Okay, it wasn't just the dinner. I want you to know that. It was a lot. It was a lot of things. I waited. "He never hit me," she said. "I want you to know that, too. He never hit me. Not the way you'd think. But there were times when he'd grab my arm too hard. There were times when he'd corner me in the kitchen and yell in my face until I cried and then leave. There were times when he'd take my phone in the middle of the night and look through every single message and accuse me of things. There were times when he'd say things about me that I started to believe. Sweetheart. And his father. His father was the architect of all of it. Brandt used to be different, Dad. I know you don't believe me, but he used to be different. When we were dating, he was sweet. He brought me flowers. He took me on these long walks and we'd talk about books. And then we got married, and his dad started coming around more. And Brandt he changed. He became his father. He became exactly his father. I believe you, I said. She started crying. Real crying, not the silent kind she'd been doing for years. The kind where her whole body shook and her face went red and snot ran down her lip, and she didn't care. I sat across from her and I held her hands and I let her cry until she was empty. When she was done, she said, "What am I going to do?" I said. "You're going to stay here, as long as you need, and you're going to figure out what you want to do next, and I'm going to make sure those people never come near you again." Dad. They're not going to just let me go. You don't know what he's like. He's going to fight me on everything. The house, the savings, even the dog. He's going to make my life hell. No, I said. He's not. She looked at me. Really looked at me. Something passed across her face. Some moment of seeing me as I actually was, not as the version of me she'd carried around in her head since she was a little girl. Dad? What did you do for work, really, before you retired? I looked at her for a long minute. Then I said, I worked with my hands, sweetheart, just not the way you thought. She didn't ask me anything else. She just nodded slowly. And then she squeezed my hand and said, Okay. That was the last time we ever talked about it, after the arrests, after the SEC complaint, after Brandt was fired and Conrad was indicted and the Mercer family found out very quickly who their friends actually were. My daughter filed for divorce. Her lawyer was a woman I'd been introduced to through my old friend, a divorce attorney out of Stamford, who specialized in high net worth cases where one party was either a federal defendant or about to become one. She took my daughter's case on a flat fee. She didn't lose. Brandt tried to fight. He tried to claim my daughter had been an unfit partner who had withheld marital support. His lawyer was paid for briefly by his mother, until Margot realized her own assets were in jeopardy through Conrad. Then his lawyer dropped him. He represented himself for the final hearing. He showed up in a wrinkled shirt with a stain on the collar and tried to argue that the marital home should be split. The judge looked at him for about 6 seconds and then awarded my daughter 80% of everything that wasn't already frozen by the federal government, on the grounds that he had hidden assets and engaged in financial misconduct throughout the marriage. The misconduct was the front-running. Federal cooperation agreements had made it public record by then. She walked out of that courtroom in March with a settlement check, a refurnished apartment in Lancaster 15 minutes from my house, and a dog the judge made Brandt hand over in the parking lot. Brandt cried when he gave her the dog. I want to be clear that the dog was not crying. Conrad pled out in August. His attorney negotiated him down from a potential 30-year stretch to 14 years in federal prison, with a possibility of release after 11 on good behavior. He'll be 78 when he gets out. Margot filed for divorce the week after his sentencing. She kept the Greenwich house, which, it turned out, had been in her name the whole time. Conrad had put it there in 2006 for tax purposes. She also kept the staff. None of them attended the sentencing. Brandt got 2.5 years for the front-running, which was less than I'd hoped for, but more than his lawyer had predicted. He served 18 months at a federal camp in West Virginia. When he got out, he moved to Charlotte, where his sister lived. The sister, I should add, had stopped speaking to him in May, when she found out that some of the money Conrad had been laundering had passed through a trust she'd set up for her kids. She wasn't charged, but she was, by all accounts, deeply embarrassed, which is a kind of justice all its own. I never saw any of them again. My daughter spent the first year just trying to remember who she was. She didn't get a job right away. She didn't date. She didn't do much of anything but sleep and read and walk the dog and have dinner with me 3 nights a week. She lost weight, then gained it back, then started running, then stopped, then started again. She cried sometimes for no reason. She laughed sometimes for no reason. She apologized constantly, for everything, for nothing, for taking up space, for asking for a second cup of coffee, for needing me. I told her every single time that she did not have to apologize for being in my kitchen. About 14 months after the divorce, she came over for dinner one night with a sketchbook. She opened it on the table. She'd been drawing again. She used to draw all the time when she was a teenager, and then somewhere along the way she stopped. The way you stop a lot of things when somebody convinces you. slowly, over years, that nothing you do is worth doing. The drawings were good. They were really good, she said. I want to try doing this for real. I want to see if I can sell some prints. I want to see if I can make a thing of it. I said, do it. She did it. She started a little online shop, the way she tried to before. Only this time, nobody was telling her she was wasting her time. Nobody was telling her she was a hobby. Nobody was throwing wine in her face for talking about it at dinner. It grew slowly. Then, less slowly. Then, by the third year, she had a small studio in downtown Lancaster and a wholesale account with a gift shop chain and a part-time assistant. She still drove out to my place on Sundays. She still brought the dog. The dog, who I should mention, is a 30-pound mutt of indeterminate origin named Otis, who hates men in suits and has never once growled at me, has become one of the great loves of my life. My daughter got remarried last spring. I want to tell you about him because he deserves to be told about. His name is a name I'm not going to share, but he's a high school history teacher in Lancaster County. He's 2 years older than her. Divorced, no kids. He plays guitar, badly, in a band that plays at the local Elks Lodge once a month. He brought me a bottle of homemade hot sauce the first time he met me and didn't try to compliment my house or impress me with anything. He just sat at my kitchen table and asked me about fishing. We talked about fishing for an hour. Then he asked if he could see my workshop. I showed him. He noticed the lathe and asked if I made my own tool handles. I said sometimes. He said, "That's beautiful work, sir." He calls me sir. I've told him not to. He does it anyway. I've made my peace with it. He treats my daughter the way her mother was treated by me, which is to say, like she is the most important person in the room, every time, without exception. He thinks her drawings are the best drawings in the world. He listens when she talks. He laughs at her jokes, the real ones, not the polite ones she used to make for Brant's friends. He shows up. At their wedding, he gave a speech in which he said, "I am the luckiest man I know, because she chose me, and she didn't have to." I sat at that table and I cried like a child. There's one more thing I want to tell you, and then I'm going to stop. A few months after Brant got out of federal camp, my daughter received a letter. It was handwritten, on cheap paper, postmarked from Charlotte. She didn't open it for 2 weeks. She brought it to my house on a Sunday, sealed, and asked me to open it for her because she couldn't. I opened it. I read it first. Then I read it to her. It was an apology, a long one, 4 pages, front and back. It talked about therapy. It talked about understanding now what he hadn't understood then. It talked about his father and how he'd grown up watching his father treat his mother that same way, and how he'd thought it was normal until he wasn't around it anymore. He didn't ask for forgiveness. He didn't ask for anything, in fact. He just said he was sorry. He said it about 40 different ways across 4 pages. When I finished reading, my daughter was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "Do you believe him, Dad?" I said, "I don't know. Maybe." She said, "Does it matter?" I said, "Only if you want it to." She thought about it for a long time. Then she took the letter from my hands, folded it back up, walked over to my fireplace, and threw it in. She didn't say anything. She just stood there watching it burn. Then she came back to the table and asked me if I wanted another cup of coffee. I poured us both another cup. We sat there until the fire burned down. The dog snored at our feet. Outside, it had started to snow. The first snow of the year, the kind of soft snow that doesn't stick to anything, that just falls and dissolves and falls again. She looked out the window. She said, "I love it here, Dad. I love it so much." I said, "I know, sweetheart. I want you to understand something. I didn't do what I did because I wanted revenge. I want you to understand that. Revenge is something a younger man wants. I'm too old to want revenge. Revenge is a feeling that costs you more than it pays you, and I'd already paid plenty. I did what I did because my daughter is the only family I have left in this world. Because her mother is buried in the cemetery in western Pennsylvania, and I promised her before she died that I would take care of our girl no matter what happened. Because for 7 years I watched our daughter become someone smaller and quieter and sadder, and I told myself it wasn't my place to step in. Because the night I held her in my kitchen and watched her cry and realized she was 28 pounds lighter than she'd been at her wedding, I understood that I had been wrong. I had been wrong for years. The phone call wasn't revenge. The phone call wasn't revenge. The phone call was correction. The phone call was a father, very late, doing what a father is supposed to do. And the rest of it, the lawyers, the dog, the apartment in Lancaster, the slow rebuilding, the snow falling outside the kitchen window, the husband who calls me sir, the studio in downtown Lancaster, the laugh I'd thought she'd lost forever. And that came back, slowly, in pieces, over years, until one night last summer, I heard her laugh at something her new husband said, and I had to walk out onto the porch because I didn't want her to see me cry. The rest of it is what I fought for, not the destruction of the Mercers. They destroyed themselves. They were always going to. They were a family built on cruelty, and they were going to come apart eventually. I just made it happen faster. What I fought for was the kitchen, the Sunday dinners, the dog, the drawings, the laugh. I fought for the freedom of my only child to exist in this world without flinching, and I would do it again. I have been turning this over in my head for a long time now, and I think what I learned, more than anything, is that cruelty is never an isolated event. It is always a pattern that has been allowed to grow. Conrad Mercer did not throw wine in my daughter's face on a whim. He threw wine in her face because for 7 years, nobody at his table had ever told him no. Not his wife, not his son, not the people he humiliated at dinner parties and barbecues and Christmas mornings, not me, especially not me. And so the cruelty grew, the way mold grows in a basement nobody checks, until it had taken over the whole house. What happened to Conrad and to Brant was not luck. It was not karma in the mystical sense. It was simple cause and effect. They built a life on contempt. They cut corners. They laundered money. They front-ran trades. They told themselves the rules were for other people, smaller people, the kind of people they imagined their father-in-law to be. And when the consequences finally came, those consequences were not delivered by fate. They were delivered by the federal government, by the SEC, by a divorce judge who had seen this pattern 100 times before. Every brick they laid in their own house turned out to be the brick that fell on their heads. I want to say something honest about my own part in this. I was wrong for 7 years. I told myself I was respecting my daughter's autonomy. What I was actually doing was being a coward. Being polite is not the same as being wise, and being quiet is not the same as being kind. Real wisdom would have meant having one hard conversation with her in year 1 instead of 7 years of pretending I didn't see the bruise under her eye. Real strength would have meant trusting that my daughter would forgive me for stepping in instead of letting her drown to spare myself her temporary anger. I learned that too late. I am still learning it. If I could tell you anything, from 63 years of mostly getting things wrong before I got them right, it would be this. Build your character the way you would build a house, slowly, on a foundation you have inspected yourself. Choose what you tolerate, because what you tolerate is what your children will marry. And when the moment comes, and it will come, when you have to choose between being comfortable and being useful to someone you love, choose useful. Every time. Even when it costs you, even when you are afraid, the comfort will come back later. The chance to protect the people you love does not.